Today we will be debating the question, is the primary use of zero tolerance in schools ethical? My name is Callie Stezer, and joined with me today to discuss are Meredith Carmack, summarizer and researcher, Katie Temple Johnson, summarizer and illustrator, and Erica Goodman, summarizer and researcher. Prior to our arguments, I will be introducing the background and some of the history of this ethical question that has led to its prominence in American society. So the term zero tolerance, it refers to policies of behavior that uniformly consecrate offenses, regardless of the severity of the offense. This means that an individual's personal record, their circumstances, and their intent are not considered when delivering punishment. Under this type of policy, an offense like chronic truancy would merit the same consequence as something like attacking and beating a classmate at school. Comprehensive reviews of the literature, like that from Lozinski et al. In 2014, showed that there are many variations in zero tolerance policy from school to school and from policy to policy, to the extent that parsimony over the definition and behavioral and consequential repertoire hasn't even been fully achieved. According to a study performed by Gage et al. In 2013, many studies examining zero tolerance policies are in fact studying systems of poorly differentiated punishment. In the U.S., the origin of zero tolerance can be traced back as far as the 1980s. And it began with federal and state drug enforcement agencies. And then within the decade, the policy style became sort of nationally known. The Civil Rights Project describes one precipitating event that propelled zero tolerance into the limelight, and that was when Attorney General Edwin Meese began authorizing the seizure of boats, vehicles, and passports of anyone crossing American borders with even trace amounts of drugs. Then by the 1990s, zero tolerance policy had been carried over to social and academic arenas as well. Some of those arenas include sexual harassment, the homeless, racial intolerance, and schools. Advocates of zero tolerance believe that punishing nearly all offenses equally has somewhat of a behavior chain interruption effect on students by threatening and exacting severe punishment of small infractions in an effort to prevent students from engaging in bigger ones. Hanot says that in principle it sets high standards, opting to send a clear message instead of leaving gray area for individuals. And of course its public appeal lies in this immediate solution, or seemingly immediate solution, to violence in schools. Separate studies performed by Melvin and Casella in 2011 and 2001 show that over the past 40 years, a resurgence of support for zero tolerance policies typically follow major school crises, such as school shootings and other terroristic acts in the schools. Despite all of this, the American Psychologist has published a report, and that report says that a comprehensive review of the literature overwhelmingly refutes the efficacy of zero tolerance policy in schools. In fact, these policies are doing more harm than good. A study by Skiba and Rausch in 2006 showed that Black, Latino, and disabled students are up to 4 times more likely to be the recipients of such punishment than others. And that's a disparity that would be hard to explain outside of bias and discrimination. Implicit bias, nonetheless, but bias still. A 2014 study by Curtis found that students, especially those of the minority background, find themselves in cycles of victimization and persecution, and then they follow a predictable trajectory, which is referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline. Zero tolerance has been demonstrated time and time again, and as early as 1986, as having an adverse effect on chronic truancy. And this has been demonstrated in a number of studies, including Gage et al. Study in 2013 and Welledge and Rudder's study in 1986, as early as 1986. It wasn't until 2000 that the American public became increasingly informed and unified in their advocacy about the detrimental effects of zero tolerance policies on youth. The Civil Rights Project of 2000 played a major role in shedding light on this issue to the American public. This debate seeks to assess the extent to which the use of zero tolerance in educational settings is ethical, and it compares the policy to researched alternatives. We will be examining zero tolerance and the alternatives to zero tolerance under the lens of the BACB Ethical Compliance Code. Next up is Meredith Carmack, and she will be discussing the school-to-prison pipeline.
Thank you, Kelly. When we think about the ethical strategy for enhancing student behavior, it should include two things: the implementation of policies that decrease behaviors that are disruptive to the learning environment, and a strategy to increase behaviors that promote learning so that students are prepared to leave schools equipped to contribute to their communities. As behavior analysts, we have to follow the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysts set forth by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. In that code, Section 1.01, we are required to use reliance on scientific knowledge in our professional endeavors. In the case of zero-tolerance policies, however, the research tells us that zero-tolerance policies have not led to a reduction in unwanted behaviors at school. They have not made our schools safer, and they have not led to a more positive learning environment. Knowing that 2 decades of research into the effectiveness of zero-tolerance policies shows them to be ineffective and even harmful violates Sections 104B and E of the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code, because following through with the zero-tolerance policy is implementing a contingency that's unethical. The behavior analyst is required to take steps to resolve this ethical dilemma. Furthermore, they do not teach a replacement behavior, which would increase the likelihood of producing a successful learning environment. In addition, zero-tolerance policies have criminalized behaviors that many would not agree are offensive behaviors at all. This has led to what R.J. Skiba, in a 2014 article titled "The Failure of Zero Tolerance," published in the journal Reclaiming Children and Youth, termed a school-to-prison pipeline. This refers to the fact that when harsh punishments like suspensions are imposed, the result is an increase of students ending up in our court and juvenile systems. The policies have targeted and criminalized questionable offenses that may not be worthy of suspension. There are many, many examples of these. A few include a 6-year-old suspended for sexual harassment because he kissed a girl on the hand, a 10-year-old suspended for making his fingers into the shape of a gun, a 7-year-old who was suspended for eating his toaster pastry into what one of the teachers thought looked like shape of a gun, and a 13-year-old who was suspended for a year for burping. These may seem ridiculous, but these are examples that are representative of the inability of zero-tolerance policies to reliably target actual threats. Proponents argue that these are just examples of poorly written policies, and that if zero-tolerance policies were written more clearly, they would be able to effectively remove threatening behavior from our schools and thus make those learning environments safer for the students and teachers. There's reason to believe, though, that even a well-written zero-tolerance policy cannot prevent biased implementation by school personnel. These policies have been shown time and again to disproportionately target minorities. Skiba also found that minority students were more often referred for subjective offenses, such as being disrespectful or loitering. Could it be that the numbers don't represent all schools, but instead only schools where the minority population is already the largest population? No, because in fact, when Skiba looked at the research, they found that these biases are present in all types of schools, regardless of their socioeconomic levels or whether they are urban or suburban. As behavior analysts, it's a violation of our ethical code 105D to be part of programs that discriminate. This one-size-fits-all punitive system burdens the juvenile courts with the responsibility to handle problems that could have been managed at the school level. D.R. Duper, in a 2010 article, "Does the Punishment Fit the Crime? The Impact of Zero-Tolerance Discipline on At-Risk Youth," published in the journal Children in Schools, found that data has shown that as suspensions and expulsions increase, so does the risk of becoming a high school dropout. In this way, zero-tolerance policies unnecessarily push out students and deprive them of their right to an education. And in so doing, they burden our communities with citizens who are not prepared to contribute to society. The statistics also show that being a high school dropout increases the probability of future incarceration. As behavior analysts, indiscriminately setting in motion this chain of increased probability of a negative outcome for a student does not meet criteria of do no harm. Even if unbiased school personnel want to apply common sense in the application of the zero tolerance policies, they may not feel safe to do so because the Gun-Free Act of 1994 requires schools to expel a student for at least a year if they bring a weapon to school or risk losing federal funding. A clear definition of what constitutes a weapon was left out of that mandate, and this left the schools to have an open interpretation of what is going to denote a weapon. This has resulted in the inequitable application of this policy, which then criminalizes children for bringing items like squirt guns and nail clippers to school. This is at odds with our role as behavior analysts because it does not meet the ethical criteria of at least restrictive procedures, and as stated in Compliance Codes 4.08 and 4.09, because a severe punishment is the starting point, and as behavior analysts, we should be advocating against a policy that leads to a school-to-prison pipeline.
Thank you, Meredith. Next to present is Erica Goodman, who will be summarizing the standardization and zero tolerance policies.
Thank you, Callie, and thank you, Meredith. Zero tolerance policies lack in standardization, and therefore creating unfair disadvantages to many of the students. Proponents argue that if zero tolerance policies were written more clearly, like Meredith had said, that they would be more effectively remove threatening behavior from schools and making learning safer for students and teachers. The compliance codes and reference would include 2.10 treatment efficacy and 2.12 records and data. Compliance code 2.10 discusses that the most effective, scientifically supported treatment must be recommended, and there's a responsibility to review alternate treatments to their side effects. And by not making the zero tolerance rules and expectations clear to all students and even the teachers, there isn't a way to determine if it's effective. Compliance Code 2.12 states that records and data should be created, maintained, disseminated, stored, and retained to follow policies and regulations. So without clearly written zero tolerance policies, the two compliance codes are definitely being violated. And when stating and defining the ethical use of behavior management, the zero tolerance policy lacks in standardization. It is also important to make rules and expectations as clear and consistent as possible. When there isn't a standard or set of social responses that all of the students are aware of, it reflects that total students who are suspended and expelled due to the zero tolerance policy. For example, in 1995, the Gun-Free Schools Act changed the terminology from firearm to weapon, and that was said by Martinez in 2009. So a few years after, many students had rules that were not even stated or even approved by the GFSA. This change decreased any standardization that the policy may have had before and made the situation even more confusing. For example, 94% of students in schools targeted firearms and weapons, 88% targeted drugs, 87% targeted alcohol, and 79% targeted fights. Later, others adopted policies concerning things like truancy, disrespect, insubordination, and dress code. And so it's easily seen that they don't have clear operational definitions and they're not consistent across school districts, schools, or even teachers. The actual GFSA lists a weapon as terms for the zero tolerance policy, but it seems that there's confusion about the term weapon. The original definition for the weapon was to be used with intent. So many cases have been turned into federal court cases because of this policy not being carried out with the standard. For example, Kajis in 2006 discussed that an 8th grade girl got kicked out of the student council and her honor society because she had a traditional pencil sharpener from South Korea that was a gift from her mother. And another example, which is insane, was a 16-year-old honor student got expelled for having a butter knife in the back of his truck, which happened to be his grandmother's that was left when he helped her move. So it obviously, neither one of these had intent when used as the weapon. The United States Courts of Appeals cannot come to a consensus when it comes to conclusions about zero tolerance policies and intent. The policy was deemed irrational when a student was suspended for a weapons possession, though the student was not even aware that they were possessing the weapon. There is clearly no standard rule for thoughts were from Pellegrini in 2003. So, without the standardization, schools will continue to get taken to court and possibly sued over policies that aren't even effective and actually may have more adverse effects on students.
Thank you, Erica. Next up is Katie Temple-Johnson, who will be summarizing the disproportionate effects on individuals within different groups.
Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about the impact between zero tolerance policies on students with special needs and of racial minorities. So Kerwin and Mendler in 1999 stated that schools should have zero tolerance for the idea of doing anything that treats a student the same, which strongly supports the notion of individualized education in our school systems today. Research conducted by Kerwin and Mendler, as well as De Beers, stated that many schools examined by policymakers and scholars found that there are significant racial disparities that have been found in student suspension and expulsion. Most specifically, African American and Latino students are more likely to be suspended and expelled. In De Beers and Zeflifer's research, African American students constituted the largest number of students expelled. In addition to the number of referrals, African American students were referred for the behaviors which include loitering, disrespect, excessive noise, threat, and a catch-all category which included conduct interference. And as we've all learned, not providing an operational definition allows this to be interpreted in whichever manner follows suit. While students, however, were referred for more explicit categories, which included smoking, endangering, obscene language, and vandalism, as well as drugs and alcohol. Along with the racial minorities, the impact on children with special education needs has been examined as well. De Beers and Zeflifer further analyzed data that determined that the vast majority of students who have been expelled should have been screened for special education services before the incident even occurred. The most common risk factors for students included indications of emotional problems, ADHD, previous trauma, participation in private counseling, therapy, and depression. So even students that have family or students themselves that are trying to seek help for these behaviors are still being disproportionately included in zero tolerance. In addition, it was found that these students could have been special education certified and received Section 504 accommodations or possessed various risk factors that would have led the expulsion incidences not to occur. With regard to students with disabilities, there is a safety net, so to speak. The Individuals with Disability Education Act, Amendment of 1997, IDEA 1997, represents the federal right that ensures and protects students' rights to a free and appropriate public education. This is for all students who have been identified as having disabilities or requiring special education or support services. In the event that a suspension or expulsion comes into being, these students under IDEA 1997 can have a manifestation determination meeting, in which people come together and discuss whether or not the incident occurred as a result of the student's disability or if it was with intent a zero tolerance act. This law preserves the principles of zero rejection, non-discriminatory evaluation, an appropriate education, and the least restrictive environment, as well as due process with the parent and student involvement. However, even with these laws and supports in place, zero tolerance policies continue to blur the lines between appropriate education and appropriate discipline. What is most concerning and potentially holding such unethical weight is that although IDEA provides protection and special rights for students who are identified as having disabilities, it does not provide recognition to those who are disadvantaged. In order to be eligible to receive special education and support services, one must be assessed and identified as fitting into specific categories. Within each category, for a student to qualify as having a disability, it clearly states that the disorder cannot primarily be due to an environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. Again, this shows an unethical representation for student populations that may face multiple hardships in their life, which include environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantages. This further supports the lack of ethical consideration for student populations that clearly need representation, yet they are not protected by the current policies that fall under zero tolerance. In regards to the field of applied behavior analysis, zero tolerance policies pose ethical concerns that specifically address various compliance codes within the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysts. The certification boards includes the 10 sections relevant to professional and ethical behaviors, which in conjunction with the ethical considerations included for the special education and disadvantaged youth come into question. Unfortunately, as these policies developed and expanded various groups of student populations, the most impacted are often the most disadvantaged. This statement alone represents the unethical undertones that go hand in hand with zero tolerance policies in our education systems today.
Thank you, Katie. Katie will also be presenting our supporting visuals for our topic. This concludes the summarization part of our debate.
Okay, so I'm going to share graphs right here. Okay, are the graphs visual for everyone? Visible?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so in the graphs listed above, we have, is the primary use of zero tolerance in schools ethical? In figure 1, we have a nice infographic that states that the youth of color, LGBT students, students with disabilities, are punished more often and more harshly than their peers for the same misbehavior. As you can see, the school-to-prison pipeline includes prison-like environments. Students feel pressures and feelings of uncertainty. There are harsh school disciplines. The out-of-school suspension numbers are staggeringly high, as you can see to the left of the infographic. And school arrests are over 70% of students involved in school-related arrests are referred to law enforcement are Hispanic or African American. In figure 2, over to the right, we have violence ranking as the highest volume of out-of-school suspensions, defiance following. It would be interesting to know how violence and defiance were defined, which could put into question another category here, drugs and alcohol, and then other. Scroll down. Figure 3, which is shown to the left, suspension rates based on demographics show a disparity amongst racial demographics. The highest population are black males, followed by black females. Then we move to Hispanic males, and next we have Native American male populations. In figure 4, we have school discipline and race. As stated through the entirety of my discussion, in every state except Idaho, black students were disciplined at a higher rate than their proportion to the student body. So for example, in Illinois, 20% of all students black might be expected to make up 20% of all students receiving suspensions. Instead, they make up 47% of students receiving suspensions. So that is 2.3 times the percentage expected. Okay, and that's good for our visuals. Back to you, Callie.
Thank you. All right, so we have two people discussing the research, and they'll be focusing on two major meta-analyses that illustrate major ethical components involved in zero tolerance. We'll start with Meredith.
Thank you, Callie. So I looked at the 2008, the American Psychological Association Zero Tolerance Task Force published a report titled Are Zero Tolerance Policies Effective in the Schools? An Evidentiary Review and Recommendations. These are their key findings regarding popular beliefs about zero tolerance and what the data shows. It seems as though violence is increasing in severity and intensity due to the increased and immediate access to the news that we see from all over the country and even all over the world, but the evidence does not support this. The data tell a different story. They show that school violence has remained at a stable level and by some accounts decreased slightly since 1985. There is also a belief that zero tolerance policies will improve the consistency in message and application of discipline across the student population, but in actuality, there is considerable variability from school to school. There is not currently a clear understanding across settings of what exactly is a behavior for which a school has zero tolerance. One of the reasons that zero tolerance policies were enacted is because the reasoning is that when students who break the rules are removed, the result is going to be a safer and more productive learning environment. In fact, what we find is that the higher the rate of school suspension, the lower the ratings of satisfaction with the school environment, and more time, not less, is spent on disciplinary matters. Another one of the central beliefs of zero tolerance proponents is that strong consequences will deter students from engaging in problem behavior. Although it might seem counterintuitive, school suspensions increase the rate of future problem behaviors from those who are suspended. Over time, these same students are more likely to drop out of school altogether. As parents and members of the community, it's believed that zero tolerance is supported by everyone, but there is not consistent support for zero tolerance policies. And much of this has to do with how much the community and the parents perceive there to be a danger and how much they feel that the behavior was deserving of the suspension or the expulsion. One of the other elements that draws people into supporting zero tolerance policies is the belief that once the subjective effects of personal biases are removed, all students will finally be treated fairly because the same standard is going to be applied across the board. However, that's not what we find. Fairness has not been an outcome of these policies because consistently we find that African American students, other minorities, those with emotional and behavioral disorders are overrepresented in the suspensions and the expulsions. And the research has also pointed to the fact that schools are now using the juvenile justice system to address infractions that were previously addressed in the schools. Overall, the study found that zero tolerance policies are ineffective and even harmful and biased.
Thank you, Meredith. Next to discuss research is Erica.
Thank you, Callie and Meredith, and mine actually goes a lot describing the same things that Meredith does. The article I chose to discuss is called A Generation Later, What We've Learned About Zero Tolerance Policies in Schools. That's by Jason Kane Brown, Trone, Portello, and Kapoor. The article begins by discussing the history that was cited in the introduction of our debate, and it also discusses the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994 and the tough-on-crime mentality that they had. It also goes on to discuss the juvenile crime rate records. If we can look at the graph, Katie, it discusses...
Give me 1 second.
Pull it up. Thank you. I don't know, I guess it won't show while I'm speaking. It shows the decline over the next decade after 1994, and that the idea of young people being feared kind of stuck. Especially after the 1999 Columbine High School attack, people were devastated and scared that something like this would happen to their own town and schools. So this is what really launched the zero tolerance policies and expanded it to encompass a wide range of misconduct that is much less harmful than bringing a weapon to school, like some of the examples Meredith and Katie had described. To put muscle behind these policies, the federal government and certain states began to increase the funding for security guards and other school-based law enforcement, and to later install metal detectors. So this is when a major shift in the school disciplinary policies and practices mirrored changes of the juvenile justice system to make it more closely resemble the adult justice system, just like Meredith had also stated. The article then goes on to discuss the policies that are carried out harsher on some students than others, which is what Katie discussed. It goes on to talk about the theory underlining the zero tolerance policies and that schools benefit when problem students are removed from the school setting. However, there is no research that actually demonstrating this has an effect. It also says that no studies show that there's an increase of the out-of-school suspensions and expulsion reduces the disruption of the classrooms. And some studies show the opposite effect. I also thought that an interesting point of the article was that nationally only 5% of serious disciplinary actions actually involved possession of a weapon. So it just goes on to discuss that the school-to-prison pipeline, which Meredith discussed for us, that includes the statement of knowing all the effects of zero tolerance. What is clear is that there isn't enough information to compel a move away from the zero tolerance practices, and that they do not make schools more safe and actually may do the opposite.
Thank you, Erica. We will conclude our debate with questions that will be presented to our debaters, and the first one is for Meredith, actually. Meredith, even though the outcomes may not be favorable for students who are expelled, doesn't it result in a learning environment that's more favorable for the remaining students?
No, although that is something that might seem to be true, as the research that we presented earlier showed that the overall climate of the school is negative the more that the expulsions and suspensions are increased.
Thank you, Meredith. Okay, so I actually want to pose a follow-up question to this one, and anyone can take this one who is able. But zero-tolerance policies do not view students' rights as paramount. So what about when the rights of other students are infringed upon by those who are aggressive and disruptive?
I'm sorry, could you say that again? I'm having a computer issue.
Oh, sure, no problem. The question was, zero-tolerance policies don't view students' rights as paramount. So what about when the rights of other students are infringed upon by those who are aggressive and disruptive? What about their rights?
Okay, I can address that. As I was pointing out before. As the school suspension rates increase, the overall satisfaction decreases. So all of the students, even the ones that are the ones left behind, they are all experiencing a decrease in their satisfaction in the school climate.
Okay, thank you. So my next question is for Erica. Erica, if zero-tolerance policies are what many schools have in place right now, what would you suggest schools do after learning all of this information on zero tolerance and how it's detrimental to schools and children?
Sure, I'll kind of refute that. I would restate to schools that there's no research supporting zero tolerance, and that no research is shown that it works at all. I really liked, and I wanted to bring up the topic of Dr. George Sugai out of UConn, and he's the director of a program called the Center for Behavioral Education and Research. And his program provides schools with evidence-based practices, keyword here, and access to the best school-wide positive behavior supports, which is a framework or tiered implementation that focuses on the positives and what students in a school should have versus zero tolerance, which focuses on what they shouldn't have. And there's also a ton of research backing this, and Dr. Sugai and his center is mostly focused on implementation of the plans in the schools and what it looks like, along with the data that show the results of the implementation, which is also key. For example, there is focus on what the ideal social skills of the student should be, for example, like being respectful, being responsible, safety, and things that they can integrate into the students' learning and into their curriculum. So if schools do a good job with the implementation, it usually captures what they call about 80% of the students. So for the students, the other 20% that need the extra help, they focus on what they can do to individualize it instead of using the aversive, like the suspension, expulsion, detention. One of the examples that it showed that had a middle school that made up a rap with these things in it, like being respectful and being safe in the halls, and all the kids wanted to participate, and they liked the rules, and they liked the rap, so it really individualizes it and makes it so all students can benefit instead of the first choice amount, there's no definition, and then you're expelled. So I thought it was a really good twist to that.
Thank you very much. Okay, so my last question is going to be for Katie. Katie, if the alternative is to use methods like behavioral services to deal with problem behaviors, doesn't that end up costing more money than simply just removing the child?
Well, yes, it is true that more time and effort is needed to use board-certified behavior analysts. And as a prior debate group before us kind of alluded to, that yes, it does cost more money. However, in the long run, it ends up being way more cost-effective. So as Bayer, Webster, Stratton, Furlong, and Wright published a study by the National Association of School Psychologists in 2000, it showed that it would be more cost-effective to take a proactive approach to preventing and dealing with problem behaviors, which makes sense. They compared this to the cost of paying welfare and prison costs for students who will become the undereducated members of our community. Likewise, there are referrals, whereas the home district may have to refer a student out to another school system if they're not able to provide appropriate education. Had they have more proactive strategies in place prior to that, the school district may not be responsible for providing another school system for the student to attend. So in the long run, it's much more cost effective.
Well, and it's almost like, I have a child with autism in my school district. Isn't it just better to just tell them not to come to my school because it's so much money to teach them? It's almost like that. You can't get rid of the kid.
Right.
Just because it's easier for everybody else, you have to still figure out a way to teach the kid. And all these in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions and expulsions really are never the solution. I mean, we know with our Tier 1, Tier 2 interventions, and we know just with principles that once you choose punishment, well, first of all, it's not going to work as punishment because clearly the behaviors aren't decreasing because you have a lot of bad kids in school too, who are really being annoying for the sake of it. You want to
Right.
And also in those cases too, there has to be a reason because they don't know what to do, so they're just going to do what they know to do, right? So teach them instead of tell them what they can do and teach them what to do versus telling them what not to do. So it doesn't end up serving anybody in the long run, and it's just like you go through this far extreme measure of expulsion or one of these suspensions, and then nothing else is going to work. You try something so drastic in the first go, and then you're just setting yourself as a school system for a failure. The teachers who want to do good, but they're kind of limited in their resource, and then you have all these bad role models like the cops who are doing completely crazy kind of behavior towards the general public, and there is no zero tolerance policy in those departments. There is no zero tolerance in our court systems, in our political system, and the little kids who don't have a voice of themselves are the ones who are getting in trouble. Where these grown-ups, there's this cop who arrested this kid, whoever. There are all these crazy videos out there of like a cop getting this kid out of a chair, dragging her out.
Yes.
Did he get suspended? Probably not. No, I think he did get suspended. But then, he came back and his pay didn't get, and he's getting paid. And the teacher, the kid who made the science clock and the teacher thought it was a bomb thing. I feel,
yes.
that the teachers end up being like these soldiers who don't use their own brain.
Right.
Because they're afraid to break the rule. And so even if the science teacher thought it looked like a bomb, but, didn't use the logic because they just want to follow. I don't think so they had anything against the kid. I'm sure the kid's ethnicity might have made them, because everybody's afraid these days.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's afraid of the one who didn't call the cop when they should have.
Right.
And
Sorry. I was going to say that's one of the challenges, I think, is because zero tolerance is being applied on students, it has a trickle down or trickle up effect on teachers. And so then they're really not they're not thinking for themselves, they're just trying not to get fired.
Exactly. They're thinking, oh, I don't want to be the one teacher. And when you see on the news is one kid shoots up 12 people, so which teacher wants to be that teacher who can see? In fact, I want to see data where zero tolerance helps, because there has to be the times where, because of zero tolerance, the kids who weren't benefiting from a typical school system were placed somewhere else because they really were psychopaths. They really had a lot of mental illness that they needed a very specific treatment. So in those cases, zero tolerance worked, but I don't know what those data are or how powerful those data are. So I think there has to be, the intention is really good. The intention, the philosophy is anybody who does bad, we don't put up with them. As a society, I think it's a great intention behind this, but the application, the execution of this thing becomes just so crazy that people just, science teacher thinks it's a bomb. Isn't that, it's not like, I'm just an arts teacher, I'm just knitting here, and that looks crazy to me because I've never seen anything scientific. So that I might take, but even, everybody's kind of under this fear thing, and the guns aren't the ones who are, who are restricted in access where it should be. So it's all crazy. Like, I don't know what in the schools, that one infographic you had, the schools look like jails. You've got surveillance camera, and you've got officers, and, people helping kids cross, and it's just like this stressful little environment where, I don't it is. It's one of those situations where, you have all these data, but I am not so hopeful that it will change unless we have a lot of, charter schools or schools who are thinking for themselves and who have like, autonomy in making these decisions. It's like No Child Left Behind kind of a thing too, where they're just like, oh, I just don't know, something needs to be done, and let's just do the paperwork, but actually the kids just still fall through cracks. So anyway, that was my 2 cents about it.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Do you have any other questions for us before we conclude?
No, I think this was a very nicely laid out and nicely structured and such poignant debate and well done, especially with what's going on. It's so relevant to the society today.
Yeah.
Very well done.
That's why I really liked the article that I described because it gave, a counter side to that, and it talks about things that are working, that they're telling the students what they should be doing instead of telling them this is what happens if you don't do what we say. So it gives them hope, and they want to participate when the teachers and the admin staff are participating. So it kind of shed new light on it for me because of all the dark things that you see, and people are always afraid. So I think it was good. It was a good twist to that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really enjoyed this and appreciate your time.
Great. Signing this off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Nick. How do I save it?
Is it all done?
Yes.